You know, it's funny when you think about relationships, right? All the ups and downs,
Yeah.
especially like the really close ones.
Yeah.
And then you see all those stats about how many people end up splitting up.
Yeah.
It really makes you think, like, what's actually going on under the surface with all those couples?
It really does. I mean, the arguments, the distance you see, a lot of times, that's really just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. So that's why we're diving deep today
Okay.
into some fascinating stuff you brought to the table.
Right.
Excerpts from the book, Philo,
Yes.
which I think translates to Satyr's Intimate Relationship Repair.
Yeah. By Wang Junhua.
That's right, Wrong Junhua.
Yeah.
So as we explore this book together,
Yeah.
our mission is to really pull out the golden nuggets, the aha moments that can help you, the listener, get a better grasp on what drives those relationship dynamics. You know, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Mm-hmm.
But even more importantly, to see how we can all step up and be more responsible for building those stronger, healthier connections.
Absolutely. And, you know, the Satir model, which this book is built on, is a really well-respected approach in therapy.
Okay.
That puts a lot of emphasis on how our family backgrounds, you know, those dynamics we learned growing up,
Right.
really affect our ability to create those harmonious relationships with our spouses.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So it's like what we learn early on really sets the stage for how we connect as adults.
Exactly.
And I love how this book uses real life stories to bring these concepts to life. It's not just theories floating around. You know, we get to see these couples dealing with stuff that a lot of us can relate to.
Right.
Plus, the book uses this really striking image, the iceberg metaphor.
Yes, the iceberg. It's brilliant because it shows how much is going on beneath the surface.
Okay.
Right. You see the behavior, the actions, but underneath there are layers of feelings.
Right.
Feelings about feelings, even perceptions, expectations, yearnings, you know, and at the very bottom, that sense of self-worth.
It's like a whole hidden world under there.
It is. It's like trying to understand a symphony. You hear the music, but there's so much more happening behind it.
I like that analogy. And the book itself is organized around 5 key areas.
Right, 5 areas.
Yeah.
So it digs into how we cope when things get tough in relationships.
Okay.
How we handle our emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Those limiting beliefs we might have that sabotage our connections.
Right.
The expectations we put on our partners, often unspoken ones.
Yeah.
And then that crucial piece about making the marriage a priority within the family.
Okay, so with that framework in mind, let's jump into our first case study, Fang Fen.
All right, Fang Fen.
She's a teacher, and when we meet her in the book, she's at her wit's end with her husband, Ming Yuan.
Right. She's had enough.
Yeah, she's totally fed up.
And you can see why when you read about Ming Yuan's behavior.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it goes way beyond just disagreements. It's verbal abuse,
Right.
even physical aggression sometimes. And this pattern of him making huge life decisions without her input at all.
Like what kind of decisions?
Well, like bringing his parents to live with them,
Oh.
buying furniture without talking to her,
Wow.
even giving away some of her things.
That's awful. She must have felt so powerless.
Absolutely. You can imagine the humiliation, the feeling of being completely disrespected
Yeah.
and oppressed.
Yeah.
Right. And it wasn't just stuff. He was controlling her schedule.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Interfering with her social life.
Wow.
Finding her and their daughter up for his company events without even asking.
That is so disrespectful.
It is. And for Fang Fen, all of this created this deep sense of resentment.
Yeah.
A real loss of her own identity.
Right.
She talks about feeling afraid to even go home.
Oh, wow.
Her inner world was filled with anger and anxiety.
It's heartbreaking.
It is. And if you think about that iceberg metaphor,
Yeah.
underneath that outward compliance that she sometimes showed,
Yeah.
there was this well of pain,
Right.
of feeling trapped and devalued.
And she didn't just sit back and take it, right?
No, not at all. She fought back. She argued with him.
Hmm.
There were even times when she retaliated physically.
Wow.
But ultimately, she always felt like she was losing the battle.
It was like a cycle they couldn't break out of.
It was like this Ming Yuan makes a demand,
Right.
Fang Fen protests, but then ends up giving in.
Like with that company event.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She was furious, pointed out the schedule conflicts, but they still went.
It really highlights the importance of boundaries, doesn't it?
It does. Being able to say no and have that respected.
Right. And that was clearly a struggle for Fang Fen.
It was. And this is where the Satir model comes in with its framework of coping stances.
Okay.
So through therapy, Fang Fen realized that her go-to communication style under stress was pleasing,
Pleasing.
or elie as it's called in the book.
Okay.
This means putting everyone else's needs first, trying to avoid conflict.
Right.
even if it means ignoring her own feelings and desires.
And Ming Yuan, on the other hand, he was all about blaming.
Exactly. Always criticizing, finding fault, trying to control the situation.
So you have these two opposing forces, but one is constantly yielding.
That's right.
And the book delves into why Fang Fen developed this pleasing behavior.
Right. And there's a clear link to her childhood.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she saw the very similar dynamic between her own parents.
Okay.
Her father was very critical and harsh.
Oh, no.
She remembers her siblings being scolded and punished,
Wow.
her mother being verbally abused.
That's awful.
It was. And so little Fang Fen decided to be the good girl.
The peacemaker.
Exactly. Believing that if she was agreeable, she could avoid making things worse.
So that pattern learned in childhood was playing out in her adult relationship.
It was, and causing her immense pain.
So how did therapy help her break free from that?
Well, a key part was connecting with her inner child,
Okay.
that younger version of herself who made that decision to please others.
Right.
So they worked on offering that child reassurance, validation, a sense of safety.
It's like giving her younger self the love and support she didn't get back then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that was essential for Fang Fen to start reclaiming her own voice.
That's so powerful.
It is.
And there was that example with the ATM card password
Yes.
that really stood out to me as a concrete step towards setting boundaries.
Right. After working through her anxieties,
Mm-hmm.
she calmly told Ming Yuan that she needed to feel financially secure
Right.
and that she was setting a new password for her ATM card.
Wow.
And you know what? Even though he wasn't happy about it,
Oh, I bet.
she stood her ground.
Good for her.
She prioritized her own needs.
And that self-encouragement she used.
Yes, stand firm, don't fall down.
So powerful.
It is. It really captures her journey towards empowerment.
Yeah, and you know that quote from Eric from about mature love?
Yes.
Maintaining individuality while uniting with another?
Right.
Fang Fen was starting to do just that.
She was. She was taking back her sense of self.
Okay, let's move on to our next case study, Xiao Zhao and Hai Dong. This couple had a different dynamic,
They did.
where Xiao Zhao was constantly frustrated with her husband's indecisiveness and what she saw as his incompetence.
Right. It's interesting because at first glance,
Yeah.
you see Xiao Zhao in that blaming stance like Ming Yuan.
Mm-hmm.
And Haidong is more like Fang Fen, pleasing and apologetic.
Right.
But the book makes a point that despite their issues, they really love their child.
Oh, okay.
And that shared love is a big motivator for them to work on their relationship.
It's good to hear because Zhao Zhao's complaints were pretty specific.
Oh, yeah. She was critical of what she saw as his clumsiness,
Mm-hmm.
his overthinking, even with simple things,
Wow.
and his slowness to take action.
She was really pointing out all his flaws.
She was.
Mm.
And unfortunately, that just made Haidong feel worse,
Yeah.
more inadequate, more hesitant.
It's that negative cycle again.
Exactly. The more she criticized, the more he withdrew.
The book talks about a really cool exercise they did with body language.
Yes. They used their bodies to show how their relationship had evolved.
Yeah. Okay, so how did that work?
Well, they started by standing together in a way that felt harmonious,
Mm-hmm.
but then they shifted to represent those communication stances from Satir.
Okay.
So Xiao Zhao took on a blaming posture,
Right.
and Haidong adopted this submissive, pleasing stance,
Wow.
and it got even more intense. Xiao Zhao actually stood on a chair
Wow.
to really emphasize that blaming position.
And how did Hai Dong react to that?
He became even smaller, even more submissive,
Oh, no.
and then he turned his back on her.
Symbolic of their emotional distance.
Exactly. And eventually they were both standing with their backs to each other.
That must have been a powerful moment for them.
It was Xiao Zhao initially felt a sense of power when she was blaming,
Right.
but it quickly turned into strain and fear.
Fear.
Yeah, she realized how much damage her criticism was doing.
Right.
And Haidong, he felt suppressed and afraid when he was pleasing.
Mm-hmm.
Then he felt a brief relief when he withdrew.
Right.
But then that was followed by loneliness and self-blame.
Wow, so it really brought their vulnerabilities to the surface.
It did. And for Xiao Zhao, it was a big breakthrough.
How so?
She finally saw that destructive cycle.
The blaming, the pleasing.
Yeah. And then more blaming and then withdrawal.
It's a pattern a lot of couples fall into.
It is.
And like with Fang Fen, they explored Xiao Xiao's past to understand her blaming behavior.
Right.
So tell me about that.
Well, Xiao Zhao grew up with a very critical mother
Okay.
who was always scolding her father, especially about money.
Mm-hmm.
And her father's response was to become passive and withdraw.
So she learned that pattern from her parents.
She did. And without even realizing it, she was using her mother's communication style in her own marriage.
That's fascinating.
It is.
And I read about how they used family constellation with dolls in therapy.
Yes. That was really insightful.
So how did that technique work?
Well, they used the dolls to represent Xiao Xiao's family members.
Oh?
So she could position them and see the dynamics from a different angle. And that helped her understand her mother's anger a bit better.
Okay.
And also see her father's withdrawal, not as weakness,
Right.
but maybe as a way to keep the peace.
That's a big shift in perspective.
It was. And allowed her to see that she was projecting her feelings about her father onto Haidong.
Because he was also withdrawing.
Exactly. When he would please or avoid, she was reacting to him as if he were her father.
So they worked on separating those two figures in her mind.
They did. It was about letting go of those old expectations.
Right.
And seeing Haidong for who he really is.
And what about Haidong's perspective?
Well, he shared how Xiao Zhao's criticism reminded him of his own mother.
Interesting.
Yeah, which triggered his need to withdraw to avoid feeling like a failure.
So both of them were reacting to those past hurts?
They were bringing those old wounds into their current relationship.
That's something we all need to be mindful of.
Absolutely.
And the book talks about how they learned to use I statements.
Yes, that was a game changer for them.
So remind me how those work.
Well, instead of blaming or accusing, you focus on your own experience.
Okay.
So you start with, when I see here.
Right.
Then you say, I feel, I think, I hope.
I hope.
And if that happens, I will feel.
So it's about expressing your own feelings without attacking the other person.
Exactly. And they also agreed on a pause gesture.
A pause gesture.
Yeah, to stop that negative cycle in its tracks.
So when things started to escalate, they could take a break.
Right, to choose a different response.
It's a simple but powerful tool.
It is. And it shows how couples who seem to be at odds might actually be on individual journeys of healing and growth.
That's a really insightful way to look at it.
It is.
Our third case study is Aylin and Kai Bin.
Okay.
And their main issue wasn't constant fighting.
Right.
It was more of a growing distance, a feeling of disconnection.
Yeah, like they just drifted apart.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Aylin also mentioned feeling kind of unpopular in general, even though she considered herself a good person. So their goal in therapy was to learn how to communicate better.
Right. They wanted to reconnect.
So tell me a bit about their background.
Well, they had been married for 6 years.
Okay.
Both university graduates working in the city.
Mm-hmm.
They had a 4-year-old daughter.
Okay, so pretty typical on the surface.
It seemed that way, but beneath the surface, they were struggling.
And things got worse after Aylin's mother stopped helping with childcare.
Right. It seems like losing that support added stress to their lives.
And maybe less time and energy to connect.
Exactly.
So what happened?
Well, Kai Bin started to withdraw even more.
Okay.
He became more silent, less engaged.
And how did Aylin react to that?
She tried to initiate conversations, but it often led to arguments or just made her feel more isolated.
Like that example where she tried to get him to go to counseling with her.
Yes. She felt completely dismissed by his response.
Yeah, and she asked that question, like, what, darn it?
Right, like would opening his mouth kill him?
You can hear the frustration in that.
Absolutely. She was desperate to connect.
And when they analyzed her communication style, it turned out she was expressing her needs through criticism and complaining.
Yeah, especially when it came to wanting more intimacy.
So even though she wanted to be closer, the way she was communicating was pushing him away.
Exactly.
I read that they did a role-playing exercise in therapy.
They did, where Aylin had to pretend to be Kai Bin.
Oh, wow.
And it was eye-opening for her.
How so?
She realized that he probably saw her as nagging and critical.
Not as wanting to connect.
Right. And it reminded her of feedback she'd gotten before.
About her communication style.
Yeah. People had told her she was difficult.
And that echoed her own mother's comments.
Exactly.
Those patterns from childhood again.
They're powerful, aren't they?
They are.
So one of the things Aylin had to work on was making direct requests.
Okay.
Starting her sentences with, I want.
Instead of criticizing or hinting.
Exactly.
And that actually helped, right?
It did, because when she apologized to Kai Bin and directly said she wanted him to come to therapy, he agreed to go.
So that shift in communication really made a difference.
It did.
And when they explored Aylin's childhood, it became clear that her critical communication style had roots in her past.
Right.
So tell me about that.
Well, as a child, she was the primary caregiver for her younger brother, who had disabilities.
Wow, that's a lot of responsibility for a child.
It was. and she often felt blamed when things went wrong.
Oh, no.
Plus, she witnessed her parents having a very strained relationship.
It sounds like she was surrounded by conflict and tension.
She was. And then there's that heart-wrenching memory she shared.
The one where her mother said, "I'd rather it was you."
Yes, referring to her brother's disability.
That must have been incredibly painful for her.
It was. It left her feeling deeply unloved and unimportant.
So those feelings from childhood were still affecting her as an adult.
They were. And even small interactions with her parents could trigger those old wounds.
So how did therapy help her heal from that?
Well, they used the empty chair technique,
Okay.
where she could talk to her inner child.
That younger version of her.
Exactly. And she could offer that child comfort and validation.
It's like giving herself the love she didn't receive back then.
It is. And she also worked on cultivating self-compassion.
Right.
So when those old feelings came up,
Mm-hmm.
she could be kind to herself.
And they also addressed her current relationship with her parents.
Yes. Trying to foster understanding and acceptance.
That's important.
It is.
And it's great that Kai Ben was supportive through all of this.
He was. He really stepped up and made an effort to communicate better.
But Lynn had another challenge, right?
She did. She found it hard to express appreciation and praise.
Towards Kai Ben.
Yes.
Why was that?
Well, it stemmed from her family and community's beliefs.
Okay.
They saw open expressions of positive emotions as suspicious.
Really?
Yeah, even labeling it as gossipy.
Yeah.
Using the term gad.
Which basically means a gossip.
Right.
So she was afraid of being seen as insincere.
Exactly. She thought expressing positive feelings meant you weren't genuine.
So how did therapy help her overcome that?
Well, they did an exercise where she had to identify specific things Kai Ben did,
Okay.
like thoughtful actions he did regularly.
Mm-hmm.
And then she had to practice expressing appreciation for those things.
So she could get comfortable with giving compliments.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And realize that it wasn't insincere.
Right.
It was about acknowledging the good things he was doing.
It reminds me of that Carl Rogers quote about hearing the deeper needs behind the words.
Yes.
In Lynn's case, her criticism was actually a cry for connection and appreciation.
It was a way of expressing those unmet needs.
Okay, our final case study is Hang Yuan and Lin Ning.
Okay.
And this one is a lot more serious because it involves physical aggression.
It does. It's a critical situation.
Yeah, Lin Ning was actually considering divorce.
Right.
After Hang Yuan's third violent outburst.
And this time her reaction was different.
How so?
Well, after previous incidents,
Yeah.
Hang Yuan would be remorseful,
Hmm.
and Lin Ning would eventually forgive him.
But this time.
This time, she was cold and resolute.
She had reached her limit.
And
what about Hang Yuan?
he was devastated.
Yeah.
He couldn't understand why he kept losing control.
Right.
He even said a previous relationship had ended because of his violence.
So it was a long-standing pattern.
It was.
Yeah.
He was desperate to change.
He begged her for 3 months to prove he could be different.
He did. He was terrified of losing her.
And what did Lin Ning say?
Well, she described him as both a hero and a demon.
Wow.
She said he was capable of great things.
Right.
But when his anger took over, he became someone else.
And for her, domestic violence was a deal breaker.
It was. That was her bottom line.
And Hang Yuan himself said he felt like he was possessed by a demon of violence.
Right. He said it had been with him since childhood.
That's a chilling image.
It is. It suggests something much deeper than just anger.
Right.
He talked about how violence had been a constant in his life, leading to isolation, criticism, and even more violence directed at him.
It's like a vicious cycle.
It was. And he felt immense guilt and shame.
But he didn't want to hurt Lin Ning.
No, he genuinely loved her.
He tried so hard to stop himself.
He did. He tried self-talk, physical restraints, even almost hurt himself to stop.
Wow.
He even used a punching bag to try and release that anger.
And Lin Ning saw those efforts, right?
She did. She acknowledged that he was trying.
There was a moment in therapy that really stood out to me.
Which one?
When Hang Yuan started blaming himself.
Oh, yes.
And it led to this release of emotion.
It did. It was like that self-directed anger was a safer outlet.
For all that pent-up pain.
Exactly.
And like with the other cases, they explored Hang Yuan's past.
To understand the roots of his violence.
And what did they find?
Well, he grew up in a family where violence was normal.
Okay.
He was beaten frequently and severely.
Oh, no.
Including a traumatic incident where his father broke his nose.
That's awful.
It shaped his whole understanding of relationships.
And he was afraid to have children, right?
He was He was terrified of repeating the cycle.
Of becoming like his father.
Exactly.
And the therapist made it clear that their work was about breaking that cycle.
It was about addressing that violence head on.
And one of their first assignments was to focus on the positive.
Yes, that was important to shift their perspective.
So what do they have to do?
Well, Hang Yan had to list 10 times he successfully controlled his anger.
Okay.
And Lin Ning had to list 10 positive things about their relationship.
So they could see that it wasn't all bad.
Exactly. And for Han Yuan, hearing his positive qualities read aloud, it was really validating for him.
Right.
It countered years of negative self-talk.
And Lin Ning shared her positive memories, too.
She did. She remembered his protectiveness and care. She even called him Hanko, a good person with significant flaws.
Right. She acknowledged the complexity of his character.
But they still had to address the trauma.
Absolutely.
So how did they do that? Well, they started with Hang Yuan, listing his most hurtful experiences.
Okay.
Then they used a combination of talk therapy, breathing exercises, and physical movements.
To help him process the trauma.
Exactly.
And they did a guided imagery exercise too, right?
They did, where he revisited that memory of being beaten by his father.
But this time feeling safe and in control.
Exactly. It was about reprocessing that trauma from a place of empowerment.
Wow, that must have been intense.
It was. A lot of emotions and physical sensations came up.
And they helped him express his anger in a healthy way.
Yes. He had suppressed that anger for so long.
And there was that symbolic act of buying the basketball.
Ah, yes.
That really touched me.
It was like he was fulfilling a childhood dream.
Giving himself the love and care he didn't get back then.
Exactly.
But forgiveness must have been difficult for him.
It was forgiving himself, his father, his family's history.
Right.
So they focused on acceptance as a first step.
Acceptance.
Yeah, recognizing that change takes time.
Right.
That it's not always linear.
And Lin Ning had to understand her own triggers, too.
Yes, so she could respond in a supportive way.
So it was a journey of reconciliation and growth for both of them?
It was. And ultimately, they decided to have children.
Wow.
With confidence that Hang Yuan could break that cycle of violence.
That's a powerful testament to the power of healing.
It is.
So as we reflect on these 4 stories, those coping stances from the Satir model really stand out.
They do. Those automatic responses to stress.
The pleasing, the blaming, the super reasonable, and the irrelevant.
Right. They can really make or break a relationship.
So let's break those down a bit more.
Sure.
We saw pleasing with Feng Fen and early on with Haidong.
All right. Putting everyone else's needs first, ignoring their own.
And that can lead to resentment building up.
Exactly.
Then there's blaming, which we saw with Ming Yuan and early Xiao Xiao.
Yeah, trying to control through criticism.
Right.
Making the other person feel inadequate.
And then there's super reasonable, which Ming Yuan used sometimes.
Right. Relying on logic and rules. Dismissing emotion.
Making the other person feel unheard.
Exactly.
And finally, the irrelevant stance.
Which we saw with Haidong and Kai Bin.
Right. Withdrawing and avoiding.
Yeah, leading to disconnection and anxiety.
But the goal is to move towards congruence.
Yes.
That state of wholeness and authenticity.
Right, where your words and actions match your feelings.
And we saw that happening in all the couples as they progressed.
We did Feng Fen, setting boundaries. Xiao Xiao and Haidong communicating more directly.
Right.
Ailin and Kai Bin understanding each other better.
And Hang Yuan taking responsibility for his actions.
It's about being self-aware and respectful of your partner.
And taking responsibility for your own emotions.
Absolutely.
Not projecting your unmet needs onto your partner.
Like we saw briefly with Yan Li's case.
Right.
It's about owning your own emotional baggage.
So as you listen to this, think about your own coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
When things get tough in your relationships,
Right.
which stance do you tend to fall back on?
The pleasing, the blaming.
The super reasonable or the irrelevant?
And how might that be affecting your connections?
It's a question worth pondering.
It is. Because moving towards congruence, it's about becoming more authentic, more self-aware.
And building truly fulfilling relationships.
Absolutely. It's a journey worth taking.
It is.
For all of us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks.
To this deep dive into intimate relationships.
Yeah.